Hello and welcome again to our discussion of the dilemma involving truth versus justice. And of course, it's not possible to talk about truth and justice without talking about the instrument of truth commissions, although we also talked about truth commissions, of course, a bit last week as well. What can we say about truth commissions? Maybe we can say this, that to the degree that truth commissions represent a compromise, it's something that states often do when they feel as though they have not got the power or they have not got the authority to engage in prosecution. It's a compromise that's taken on a life of its own. There are now a lot of variations, different types of structure, different goals of truth commissions, different scopes and so on. But I think it also takes on a life of its own in the sense that truth commissions have developed a rationale that goes beyond the principle of compromise. That for one thing, truth commissions have the goal very often, at least the stated goal, of focusing on recognition of victims and on affirming their dignity, something that very often does not happen as much as trials are thought of as a dramatic instance where somebody gets a moment to tell their story. Very often victims do not get the opportunity to tell their story in a trial. The story that they want to tell is subordinated to the facts that the lawyers on each side and the judges want to obtain, and they find themselves frustrated and limited. A second element of truth commissions is that increasingly, as truth commissions have developed more and more, originally most truth commissions were panels of experts who would do some research and produce a report. So the only element of their work that was public was the report. Over time, what you see more and more is that the activity of truth commissions is a public activity. Hearings are conducted publicly. People are invited to tell stories. Audiences are invited to affirm the stories that are being told by victims. And what this means, one of the biggest transformations that you have seen in the way that truth commissions are designed and the ways in which truth commissions are used, is that they have shifted from having the utilitarian purpose of providing documentation and offering some kind of substitute for legal prosecution, that is, of truth commissions using testimony as information, more into a kind of performance of public therapy, that the giving of evidence and testimony to truth commissions is a way for victims to unburden themselves and for people who hear the testimony to publicly affirm the status and the experience and the feelings and the value of victims. Now, once we start thinking about the telling of truth as a form of therapy, some other issues are raised. And so we can offer some critiques of the truth as therapy approach. If we are thinking of truth as therapy, does that mean that we think of victims as patients, that we're offering them some kind of treatment, that there is a hope of making them better? If we think of them as patients, does this also mean that we think of them as being ill or as being damaged in some way? That is the performance of respect for victims also simultaneously in some ways a performance of disrespect for victims? A second problem that is raised is most of the emphasis on truth as therapy involves victims telling their stories, but truth commissions do not only engage with victims, they also engage with perpetrators. Does it make sense to think of victims and perpetrators as having the same needs, or of them as having the same goals? A third problem has to do with the political environment in which truth-telling takes place. I mean, one of the premises in which we started at the beginning is that post-conflict and post-regime justice initiatives are partly about what we could call moral or ethical issues, issues of universal meaning, but they are also in very large measure about politics, and they're about affirming and consolidating and performing the power of an incoming regime. In particular, the power of an incoming regime to satisfy some needs, to do some justice. There is a question of whether then, if part of the power involves imposing accountability for the experience of the past, can this be done without displays of power? Is this whole machinery of offering judgments, of putting people in prison, of depriving them of rights. Is this whole instrumentation necessary to this process of political consolidation? One of the things that happens in political consolidation is that the new rulers display their power. And then finally, this is something that Krogh in her book covers in great detail, that one of the great assumptions behind this model of telling truth as a way of offering therapy is that there is an audience that is in some way homogeneous, that everybody in the audience is attentive, everybody in the audience is morally engaged, and everybody in the audience shares the same goals. And that might not be valid. The performance of therapy might be directed toward only a part of the audience, and it might be a way of reproducing rather than of resolving political divisions that exist in the context in which the truth-telling is taking place. Let me raise, however, also a larger problem. What is possibly the main problem with the restorative justice model, and you can see it right there in the label that is added to restorative justice. That is that somehow people are restored. And restorative justice works very hard on emotional and moral restoration, that is on affirmation of victims. This is the basic principle behind restorative justice. The principle that motivates it is that it is possible to remove or to reduce causes of conflict that could eventually become causes of violence by addressing human needs and by promoting equality. The difficulty here is that most of the inequalities that are at the root of conflict and violence are not emotional and moral in character. They are structural and political and economic in character. That is, they have to do with inequalities of distribution, inequalities of power, inequalities of representation, whether these are structured by ethnicity or by class or by some other issues. And these are conditions that truth commissions are able to mention, but are usually unable to influence. And in fact, it's been the case in the report of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in the report of the Commission in Argentina on disappearance of persons and so on. There is mention of the economic roots of violence, the roots of violence and conditions of economic inequality, the ways in which violence was used as a way of either maintaining or enhancing economic inequality, and they made recommendations on the level of economic inequality. The South African Commission made very ambitious recommendations for payments, for redistribution of property and wealth. The commissions have the ability to include this in their reports, but they do not have the ability to assure that recommendations of this type are implemented. Now, what this amounts to, and I'm going to try to sum up here, the basic dilemma that we are faced with in talking about the dispute over truth versus justice, that is this. When we say truth versus justice, it looks as though we are being presented with a choice. You can have one or you can have the other, and in order to get one, you have to sacrifice the other. And I wonder whether this is a real dilemma. Does it ever really happen that justice is chosen or that truth is chosen, and that as a result of this choice, one of those goals is achieved and the other one is not? I expect that in most concrete empirical cases that we can think of, this is not what happens. What you see is some kind of mixture. I mean, it probably goes without saying that just like in every other sphere of life, neither truth nor justice is ever completely achieved, although this is one of those observations that sounds like a deep insight, but is in fact a trivial point. But what it means is that choices are made that have all kinds of content. They have moral, political, practical content. They have content on the level of choices regarding policy and priorities of states and regime. These are the kinds of questions that I hope we open up by talking about the dispute over truth versus justice, and that I'll look forward to discussing with you in our session when we meet.